Alright, going ahead and starting to knock out some of the wiring on this car. I'm actually kind of far. I didn't really film a whole lot of it. Good chance I can probably get the thing started today. I'm just working now on tying some stuff into, well, I was actually using the fuse box to trace some wiring for the ignition circuit. Alright, so here's what I have so far. So I have a battery cable coming from alternator over to the fuse box here. I have another wire coming back down from the alternator. This is actually the wire that came with the car that was burnt, but I cut it shorter. This wire is loomed, comes back this way, down through here. And then I have two firewall bulkheads coming through here. This one is grounded to the engine block. This one has the starter wire and the alternator wire on it. Then I just have this little green wire coming through to actually start the starter. Didn't really work on too much I/O yet. I did run the Sloppy Mechanics alternator and flex harness to the power tap. I do have one wire going up to the boost controller. Well, actually this wire here is going up to the boost controller. This wire is coming up and coming over to this fuse box here so I can trigger the fans. Then again, I have the flex input here on the sloppy harness, and then I just ran the sloppy harness along where the brake line is. So it just comes along, follows the brake line, comes all the way down here, and it's actually perfect length, and comes out here and goes into the flex sensor. Inside the car here, this is just kind of on here temporarily. This is the starter wire, that green wire that was coming through. Do have the two firewall bulkheads. Then I just have the power and ground coming all the way back this way to the battery. Here's the main Holley power and ground leads. I'm also running the small ground all the way to the back. And then the main power is gonna run probably right to here. These wires are tucked all the way underneath the carpet. I did remove the seat belt actually to tuck it down a little bit farther. And I have those wires coming out this way and then going straight back to the battery. And I just have the power and ground here connected to the battery. I'm using a 175 amp breaker connected right off the battery. Power and ground from the Holley coming right back to the battery. So that really cleans things up quite a bit. I am going to mount this under here. This is just the factory fuel pump and level sender wiring. I gotta figure out what I'm going to do with that yet. I was thinking about maybe repurposing one of these fuel pump wires to go up to that box up front and trigger the relay, because these wires here should go all the way up to the front where that box is, and all the I/O is connected here, and that box is right here, and these wires have fuel pump wires in them that are going all the way to the back. So if I can just repurpose one of these wires in the harness and then connect it right to the output wire, then I won't have to run a separate wire through the car. I can just reuse the wire that's already there. And even if I wanted to use that like as a trigger wire, because I already have one of the trigger wires, or I could just run another small wire all the way through that harness, and that wouldn't be a big deal either. So kill switch setup, I'm working on figuring this stuff out. So this is kind of tricky right now because the power and ground actually go directly to the battery from the Holley. So even with the small ground disconnected, it still didn't kill the Holley. Even with the small constant power disconnected, it didn't kill the Holley. And I also don't even have a chassis ground hooked up right now to the battery. I just have that main firewall bulkhead coming up and then bolted to the bottom of the block down here. And that wire alone is enough to actually run everything in the car. So I tested everything. As soon as I close that breaker, I can power everything in the car and the starter works. And I don't have a chassis ground. I don't have like an engine to chassis ground. Don't have any of that stuff. I just have that one wire bolted to the block, and everything is grounded well enough through the block, through the mounts, through the K-member to the chassis that everything in the car works. Dash lights work, headlights work. So I still will add a chassis ground and stuff, but what I'm getting at is the kill switch. I can't just kill the ground because the Holley's still connected directly to the ground. So I could kill the car, but the Holley would stay on. And then killing the power side, the power is still connected to the Holley. And then with a 2-pole switch, because that's only a 2-pole switch back there, you still have power, battery, and the Holley connected to the battery on one side. And then on the other side of the switch, you'd still have the alternator feed and main power, which I think is exactly what was going on when the car came in. Remember, when you flip the switch, it didn't kill the car, and the ECU actually stayed on until you flipped the switch again and then flipped it back, then it would kill the ECU. So the switch then was actually on the ground side, and I was able to basically replicate that same issue. NHRA standard is that it's supposed to be on the positive side of the battery. So what I'm doing is I'm actually going to run the positive side of the battery to the switch, and then I'm going to have the switch trigger a separate isolator type relay that I have under the dash right now to kill all the ignition. So it'll kill the Holley, kill the power. That actually looks like this right here. So it's a big relay. It's a 120 amp relay, and I cut all the ignition wires and then split them basically here. So this wire here This wire here is going to be a ground, and this wire here is going to be a positive that's going to go back and go to the kill switch. So I'll be able to come off the positive side of the battery power, send this to the other side of the switch. When I open the switch, this will shut off this relay, and it splits all the ignition to the car. And I'll also still have this breaker set up here. So I guess the logic behind having it on the positive side is that if the car gets crumpled up, like a body panel or something could split a wire and then give it ground and then not allow it to shut off. So you want to split the power side, kill the power side to prevent that from possibly happening. And then also everything is fused and it has that breaker on it. So like if it did crumple up and split a line, it's fused like 2 inches from the battery, or has a breaker 2 inches from the battery, then all of the fuses would be in place to protect it from fire. And then opening that circuit would kill all the ignition, kill the fuel pumps, and shut the car down. So that's how it should work. I'll test it, make sure it does work that way. But that's kind of where I'm at with this now. So I'm gonna keep doing some wiring and I'll come back when I got some updates. All right, so doing some brainstorming here. So the fuel pump relay is actually inside of here. This green yellow wire is the power to fuel pump wire. So this comes through here, through the firewall. Then it comes down here to this whole section where there's already a bunch of plugs that were cut. So first thing I noticed was that this little bundle up here is cut and that there's a green yellow wire in there. So the wire coming from the box is cut. I did find that it comes back down to this plug here. So I got 2 wires pulled aside, and I'll show you why in a minute. So there's my green yellow. That one comes all the way through here, and you can see in this little fuel pump wire bundle I don't have a green yellow wire. So I trace the wiring, it comes back over to the driver's side, and then it comes down to the inertia switch here. So this plug on the inertia switch has that green yellow wire, and then it comes back out as a pink black. And then now you can see this pink black wire is actually in the fuel pump plug. So the next thing I did was I looked at this gray red wire, and then I just connected another wire to it so I could run it up to the front. Now here's that gray red wire, and if I put the lead on it, here I have continuity there. So now I know I have a lead coming back here with the green yellow, and this wire here goes all the way back to that plug. So I can essentially use the factory wiring as my trigger wires for the fuel pumps, and I don't have to run new wires. So essentially what I'll do is I'll take the green fuel pump wire from the Holly, connect that to this green white wire. That'll be like the main 12 volt wire coming back for the relays. This will be my trigger for the secondary fuel pumps. I did verify that this black red wire here is a ground. It has continuity to ground. I checked it on this little self tapper here, and it does have continuity to the battery. So I'll be able to tie both fuel pump relays into the ground. I'll have the gray red as the secondary trigger, and then I'll have the red black as the primary 12 volt to the relays. What that'll do is allow me to still be able to use the inertia switch for both fuel pumps. Then what it'll be able to do here is, one is a 12 volt trigger, because that's that green wire from the Holly as the primary. So that one's a 12 volt trigger. The secondary output for the secondary fuel pump is going to be a ground trigger. So what I'll be able to do is take the green wire through the yellow green through the inertia switch. That'll be the trigger for this relay, and turn this one on. And then what I'll also do is use that 12 volt, and then that will come to the 12 volt side of this for the coil. So the secondary fuel pump won't be able to come on unless the primary fuel pump is already running. 12 volt will run over to here, and then the other side of the coil will be grounded. So again, from the green wire 12 volt on the Holly, through the green yellow, through the inertia switch, to the red black, to the primary fuel pump. That 12 volt will also be the 12 volt for the coil side of the secondary fuel pump. And then I can give it ground when I want to enable this, and then I'll just have to run the main wires that'll actually run the pumps, if that makes sense. Okay, so I got all of it wired up back here. I got the 2 fuel pump relays there, so all of this should be able to be hidden behind that rear panel. I did add one 4-pin Deutsch connector there, so you have both positives, both negatives for both pumps. Loomed everything going down, and everything is loomed under here. Also decided to bend this down so that breaker isn't sticking out like it was. Just made more sense to run it down. And then the kill switch and the fuel pump positives come off of the opposite side of the breaker there. And then what I did was I actually ran some 8-gauge wire for the fuel pumps. There's a black 8-gauge there, and then there's a red. There you can see both of them. Black and red 8-gauge, and then I ran them down to here where I split them. And then this part here coming off the switch, I actually just ran a wire straight from this pink black to this red black here. So the red black is actually the one that goes to the fuel pump. So that's the one I used before. And I had it wired and it actually worked, but I kind of messed up when I was testing it. So I thought it didn't work. So what I have now is this pink wire just spliced right in there, so it goes directly from the pink wire on the switch to the red wire. That's what passes my 12 volts down here. Here's my green, yellow, and then here's this like gray, red. This is the 12 volt that's going to go to power both the relays and give the trigger for the first pump. This is going to be the ground activated one for the second pump. So you can hear if I give this one 12 volts, I have a click. And then now if I give this one ground, while giving this one positive, so I'm giving the green one power, and then I'm giving the gray one ground, and both pumps work. So, or both relays I can hear clicking. So now if I don't give the green wire power, the secondary pump doesn't work because it's actually getting its power to the coil from the 12 volt wire here. So when I did this initially, it didn't work, and I thought that I messed it up or did it wrong. And then I tested continuity on this pink wire, and I'm like, oh crap, it's not working. Like, it's not actually passing a signal to the relay. But this pink black wire goes back up to the front. That's why I split the harness open here to see if it actually came through here. And it's this red black wire. So this pink wire actually goes back up front. So I'm like, oh crap, it probably needed to have the ignition on or the key forward. And then I retested it with the key forward, and everything worked fine the way it was. But I'm just going to leave this one spliced in there for now. Even though it did work the other way, I already did this, so I'm just going to leave it like that. Because this wire isn't going to have power unless the key is forward anyways, because this is getting power from the 12 volt on the ECU. So it still isn't going to work unless the key is actually on and the ECU is on. Okay, so a little update on this fan wiring here. I got everything tested, everything works. I did test the fan. Did a little bit different than how I explained it in the original video. In the original video, I explained that it was fan running all the time unless you gave it ground, and then it would turn the fan off. So what I decided to do differently was, instead of giving it ground to shut it off on pin 14, which I explained in the first video, which was the fan input, I decided I was just going to ground the box with the Holley output. So when I ground the box with the Holley output, it turns everything on, runs the fan. So now ground output will enable the fan like normal. But to make that work, I originally kind of got to that point because the box didn't have ground. I hooked it up how it should have been, like how I tested on the bench, and this box didn't actually have ground continuity anywhere. So I cut the ground on here, and then I was like, hell, I'll just give it ground from the Holley then and turn the box on. But then my problem was that it didn't have the switch 12 volt or the ignition hot on from the pin 13. So pin 13 on the backside here is this white blue, and that's actually the ignition like 12 volt positive that turns this box on. So now what I did in here was I just ran a jumper from pin 3 to pin 13, because this pin 3 and pin 4 come from the battery. So I ran a jumper from pin 3 to pin 13, which gives the box 12 volts, but it's not actually going to turn on until I give it ground to pin 15, which is coming from the Holley. But what I also had to do to make this work was cut pin 18 on the back. So this is also used for the fuel pump relay. So the input for the fuel pump relay was on pin 18, and I cut that one, and then everything worked. So the fan did work with it hooked up like that, but with pin 18 connected, as soon as I gave it power, it would turn the box on. So not using pin 14, I spliced pin 3 and pin 13 together. I cut pin 18, which is for the fuel pump, like the factory fuel pump input, and then I'm giving ground to pin 15 on the backside from the Holley. I also spent way too much time trying to figure this out, but I'm nearly 100% sure that I have a working kill switch now. So there's everything on. Fuel pump prime shuts off. And then when I hit the kill switch, it shuts everything off. Kill switch back on, turns everything back on. So essentially what I did there was use that big 120 amp relay and traced all the wires that were coming from the fuse box into the cab for the ignition and split all those, so now those are all being controlled by that relay. So it essentially works like a battery isolator. I just have it kind of under the dash before everything gets to ignition. Otherwise, with the way that the Holley's wired directly to the battery, I would have needed to run another lead all the way back, like another alternator lead back, a battery lead back, and then have a 4-pin or a 4-pole switch so I could disconnect both and disconnect power from the fuse box, like to shut the alternator off from the fuse box and all that junk. So I don't think this is exactly like NHRA spec, but it's wired on the positive side. It does cut off all ignition to the car. It does cut off the Holly. I haven't tested with the vehicle running yet, but the way that it's wired, it's essentially like pulling the key out of the car. So it's gonna be pretty difficult to see down here with the camera, but you see the big relay there. And then on the right side, you have all the ignition wiring coming in. And then on the left side, all the ignition wiring coming back out. So it's a 120 amp relay, and this is essentially all of the power that leads up to this ignition switch here and cuts everything off when the kill switch is off. So that completely cuts all of the power going into the car from the fuse box. There's a breaker like 2 inches from the battery. Do have the breaker here, so that should all be okay. I did put the oil in the car. I'm going to do the transmission fluid and then put the drive shaft in. I had to paint the drive shaft or repaint it because it was actually kind of scuffed up in some spots when I picked it up. So just threw another coat of black on it. So let's do that. I'll fill the transmission fluid, put the drive shaft in, and I don't think I showed the inside of the car yet. I'm not sure if I recorded that yet. If I did, we'll figure it out later. So I have the power coming from here for the main fuel pump from the Holly green wire. And then I have secondary fuel pump wire. I do have the CAN bus splitter, one for the cable, which I have in the glove box, one for the 3.5-inch dash. Then I have everything else loomed coming across here, which is like all the ignition, the inputs, outputs for the trans brake. I do have a fuse here coming off this lead. This is for the trans brake. With the trans brake relay here. And then essentially what I have is a ground on the dash. Ground comes over to the button. Ground goes over to the Holly. And then the output comes from the Holly over to the relay to trigger that, and then it sends power through to the trans brake. So I'm gonna stop rambling. I will get the tranny fluid in, drive shaft, and then I'll load the tune in it and see if we can start it. All right, so I got oil filter on, all the fluids in except for the coolant. I got a rag over here soaked with transmission fluid. I'm gonna put the dipstick in for the transmission. Got the drive shaft in. Loaded all the inputs and outputs and everything on the ECU or on the SD card here. I'm going to put that on the computer. So programmed trans brake, boost controller, fan. I didn't do the flex. I just left that off. So I just disabled all the tables and then unpinned flex for now. So yeah, I'll load the file and we'll see what happens. Try to start it. Alright, it's a little weird when I loaded the file, the trans brake solenoid or the trans brake relay kind of like freaked out. It was like pulsing really fast, but then I keyed it off and keyed it back on and then it was fine. So I tested the button and I could hear the relay click and solenoid click. So that's all good. I guess I'll just try to start it and see what happens. I'm gonna put a charger on it. The battery's dropping to like 8 volts. Alright, got the charger on it now. I'm trying to think if I forgot anything. Still dropping to like 9 volts, so I'm gonna let it charge for a bit. Ain't got no gas in it. Could that be true? There's just not enough gas in it? Alright, so one thing we want to do is make sure this kill switch works. That's on. Mint. Alright, so I put a belt on, got the radiator filled. I did heat cycle it once and made some changes to the tune already. I didn't run a new wizard, I just reworked the old file. Changed the injector size and everything. The learn and close loop tables were set to like 15%. The learn table was down to like 10% with an on RPM of like 1300 RPM. So the learn wasn't even working. The closed loop was pegged at 15%. It was trying to pull fuel and it was stuck at 15 because that was the limit. So I changed all that stuff, pulled the 15% out of it, and now I'm going to cycle it again. I did run it up to temp. The fan turned on. That was all working. So far everything's working first try. The only thing I haven't really tested yet is the boost controller, obviously. So if I key on, you can hear the trans brake. Trans brake in reverse, so that works. Fan works. Let's give this bish a start. Temps 160. I got it set to come on at 180. Now it's learning. That's good. So everything seems to be working okay so far. There was a little bit of fuel that was like coming out of the exhaust, probably from all the cranking that I was doing initially trying to start it, because I think there was just so little fuel in it that it wasn't even trying to fire, so it was pushing fuel out into the exhaust, probably. So got the exhaust up to temp, cook all the moisture out of it. I'm skeptical on the radiator if this radiator is actually going to be enough. This is just the stock V6 radiator. So he might have to upgrade the radiator later, but I guess we'll see how the temps do driving around. So I think the rest of it is just going to be kind of buttoning things up. I still have to do the catch can lines. What I'm probably going to do is like the AN cap on that side, and then weld the bung on this side and run 2 lines. That's what I'm thinking. I still have to run the intake air temp bung into here, and then the rest is just kind of buttoning everything up. Put the bumper back on, clean up this wiring back here, remount this thing up high. I might just cut all this stuff off, but it would work just tying it all back. Still got to rivet my grommet in, then put the seats and everything back in. I think I'm going to run a couple more grounds, because right now this doesn't have a battery to chassis ground, and it doesn't have an engine to chassis ground. The only ground that it has is the battery to engine. So I'm guessing everything is just grounded well enough, like through the mounts, engine mounts, transmission mount, that it's grounded okay and working. But I will add a couple other grounds. Gotta tie down this radiator yet, so a lot of just kind of tying up loose ends. Little stuff, but almost ready to ship this thing out of here.